If you've listened to our podcast in recent weeks, mostly the last 2 weeks, you may have heard me discussing the idea of a video for this channel. And it was about indie games. We've been discussing indie games a bit on the podcast, and there's a whole discussion I was a little worried about getting into because, again, when I do these videos, I'm not out to cause trouble. I'm not out to badmouth people or anything like that, but it's been a topic that I've really wanted to address, and I figured, you know what, let's just go for it. In my daily travels around the internet, I see all kinds of comments about video games and all kinds of discussions and debates and wars and whatever you want to call them. And the one I'm focusing in on here is indie games versus AAA games, because this has been a discussion that's been going on for years, but more recently it seems like it's really picked up a bit, and I don't know why that is, but it is what it is. So I'm gonna, in this video, talk about the whole idea of AAA games versus indie games and how silly I think that is. I think one of the most basic ways to point out how silly this argument is just to look at what a AAA game is versus an indie game. So, you know, there's no like dictionary term for AAA video game or indie video game, but there are certainly wiki pages, so I'm going to use that as the next best thing. AAA game, here's what it says. AAA game is an informal classification used for video games with the highest development budgets and levels of promotion. AAA game development is associated with high economic risk with high levels of sales required to obtain profitability. Then when you switch over to indie games, it says, indie game is a video game that is created without the financial support of a publisher. Indie games often focus on innovation and rely on digital distribution. So, as you can tell, some of the things that are on this wiki page for indie game I think have changed a bit over the years, because there are certainly higher budget indie games, and there are indie games that work with, or that come out through publishers as well. But, you know, by and large, you get the idea. So right there, the idea, if you're just going on that, is a bit silly to argue it. What are you saying? I don't, so this, you know, is focusing on people who are like, I don't want anything to do with indie games. So you're saying I don't want anything to do with games that don't have the financial support of a publisher. I want AAA video games, games that have really high development budgets and are promoted in a big way. Like, does anybody really say that? Does anybody really think that? They're like, oh man, look at this indie game. I don't want it because a lot of money didn't go into it. Or does anybody say, oh man, look at this AAA video game. So much money is going into it. I can't wait to play it. Obviously, that's not how it works. So I think that, you know, like I said, I think that makes the whole thing a little silly right there. But obviously, there's many different aspects to this conversation. So I'm going to get into those. But I just felt the need to point out what both terms really mean. So when I'm seeing all these comments, and there are certainly a lot, indie games more often than not are bashed for being indie games, which, you know, is something I don't understand. So when you're looking at stuff for the Switch, you see like people saying, I don't want these indie games on the Switch. I want AAA stuff. I want the big name games on the Switch. And then if you look at other platforms, you see people just commenting about how they don't want indie games at all on the platform. They shouldn't even exist. Just today, I saw a comment that said, it was talking about, oh, what's the name of it? Little Nightmares. And somebody was saying, Little Nightmares, this indie game receives a higher review score than Resident Evil 7? Yeah, right, that's not possible. Like, you know, how could this indie game possibly get a better review score than Resident Evil? I mean, Resident Evil is a household name, and Little Nightmares is this little independent title. There's no way this game could be better. And, you know, for both of those circumstances I pointed out, I just don't understand it. I don't get where the level of distaste or disdain comes from people when they look at indie games and they're like, man, this offends me that it's on the platform. I don't even want it there. Or like, these games aren't even worth my time. I don't get it. When it comes to indie games, I think a lot of the issue stems from people looking at a certain type of visuals and thinking that it means the game is low quality, cheap, or a low effort, and that is certainly not the case. Plenty of indie developers definitely use a more old school approach in the visuals, and even in the soundtracks when it comes to, you know, graphics akin to what you'd find on the Super Nintendo and Genesis or the NES, just more simplistic graphics. But It's a visual style that the developer has chosen to put forth the game that they're making. And just because it has that visual style certainly doesn't mean it's any low effort. The developers, however big or small the independent team is putting a lot of effort into that stuff, especially when you consider the animation and other aspects that go into that. And pixel art is somewhat of a lost art among the big name companies because they don't do it all too often, and the indie scene is kind of keeping that alive. There are certainly companies that do sprite and pixel work nowadays, like Nintendo certainly still does that stuff, but it's not where it used to be. But yeah, a lot of people look at that type of visual and are just, there's nothing wrong with looking at that type of visual and being turned off by it and saying, oh, I really don't like the design or the visual approach of that game. It doesn't tickle my fancy. That's fine. I completely get that. That's not how I feel, but I understand that. But to look at that type of visual and say, oh, that's low effort, that's low quality, that's garbage, like that does not make sense for me at all. Furthermore, I think to question the effort that a developer puts into their game based on the visual style that they use is really disrespectful. To look at something and see that it takes an old school approach in visuals and be like, well, that's low effort, or they don't know what they're doing. That's very disrespectful. A lot of these indie projects are done by very small teams, if not a single person, and they are passion projects in every sense of the word. These people are dedicating years of their lives to work on every single aspect of a game, the soundtrack, the visuals, the gameplay mechanics, all that stuff. And they're doing this while they're also working a regular job. Or they've quit their regular job and are living off life savings to make these passion project games. There's no lack of effort here, and that goes for the large majority of indie games without a doubt. And I'm not saying there's a lack of effort on the AAA side either. There isn't. But usually you don't hear about the lack of effort coming from AAA. You hear about indie devs being put down because there's smaller teams or whatever, and people equate that to lesser gameplay experiences, and it boggles my mind. So I've been trying to figure out what people really mean when they're saying, I don't want indie games, I want AAA games. It's still not something I'm completely comfortable in saying that I've gotten it figured out, because I don't, but I've been looking at it akin to what you get in the movie industry. So, the best thing, obviously there's an independent movie scene, but the best example I can think of, or the best thing I can liken it to, is like art house films as compared to Hollywood blockbusters. So art house films usually aren't very action-packed, and they're focused on character development and story, telling a specific story. And Hollywood blockbusters are usually, very big name brands that have tons of money thrown at them. So we have lots of special effects and lots of like over the top elements and just, loud and in your face and stuff like that. Obviously, all Hollywood blockbusters don't fit into that, but by and large, most of them do. And I'm not saying either of those things are wrong. It's not wrong to want an art house film, and it's not wrong to want a Hollywood blockbuster. I certainly enjoy both of those genres. But when you look at that from the game side of things, I'm starting to think maybe what people are really saying is they want, instead of the indie titles, which they may think of like as smaller experiences or games that explore certain mechanics more than others, or maybe are more focused on story elements or trying to do something unique with story. They're more looking for like the big name brands that give you the big name scope, scale, and action that you'd expect. So like, AAA or AAA game, yeah, would be like your Resident Evil or your Call of Duty or Halo or Legend of Zelda, just something that like is as far as gamers go, as a household name, and you're going to get like a larger experience from it, or even just the fact that like the name of the game itself, the franchise, has a certain amount of like awareness tied to it, or holds a certain amount of weight to it. Just like you know, if somebody says like, hey, Snake Pass is coming out, people are going to be like, what the hell is Snake Pass? But if we say like, hey, Resident Evil 7's coming out, they're like, oh, Resident Evil, yeah, I could get into that. So it still irks me that people dismiss the indie side of things because they just want what they want from the AAA side of games. But the other thing is that there definitely is that content in the indie side of things. Let's just look at some quick examples off the top of my head, like Minecraft, one of the biggest and best examples of an indie game. And I guess if you're on the internet complaining about there being too many indie games and not enough AAA games, and when you do that, you are actually saying so with the definition of what those games mean, then I guess Minecraft doesn't apply because it has moved from indie to AAA. But I'm guessing most people don't mean that. So you're looking at Minecraft, and it is without a doubt an indie game. That's how it started. And like I said, the core mechanics and what made the game Minecraft are still the core mechanics today. They've added in some new content in there over the years, obviously, and updated things. But what made Minecraft back then is still what makes Minecraft now. Then you have games like No Man's Sky, another game that is absolutely massive in scope and scale. That game may not have met with critical reception or public reception that was expected prior to its release to match in with the hype, but it's still a grandiose indie game without a doubt. You have something like Stardew Valley, which is a game you could play forever, basically. That is a game that doesn't really have an ending to it, and you can just go on for as long as you'd like. Then you have Kerbal Space Program, which is definitely another indie game that is very huge in scope and scale and provides endless amount of gameplay. There's Undertale and Fez, which are two games that may not be as huge as those previous games in scope and scale, but they certainly have a whole bunch of extra content in them and a whole bunch of secrets to find, and a whole bunch of replayability and multiple endings and stuff that keeps you coming back without a doubt. There's Ukulele, and Shovel Knight for that matter. There's two good examples that show you games that have a very big scope and have a lot of content to them and keep you coming back to play for quite some time. And they obviously, they are both platformers, but they certainly handle themselves differently, and they certainly present themselves in a different visual style, but they fall in nonetheless. These are just, like I said, off the top of my head, some quick examples of indie games that provide, tons of hours of gameplay, tons of content to explore, a very grand scope in more ways than one. So I think it has something to do with these indie games not having the ability to get their name out there, or not having the funds, I should say, to get their name out there and promote themselves, or just not having a franchise that they're tied to for a number of years now. And, that is certainly a disadvantage, but I don't think it's a reason why people should just brush off indie games. The majority of this video has been defending indie against AAA, and that's because, by and large, online, at least I see a lot more people who bash AAA or bash indie and support AAA. But I don't see a lot of people that are bashing AAA and supporting indie. When it comes to bashing AAA, I usually see them bashing a specific game or something like that. But there certainly are people who defend the indie scene and crap on AAA games and say stuff like every game looks the same, every game, or the majority of games have a realistic approach to graphics, and it leaves things looking bland and similar. There's too many first-person shooters. There's first-person shooters all over the place. Everybody's got to do a first-person shooter. There's not enough variety in genres. There's not enough innovation in games. Every game plays exactly the same, stuff like that. And I'm saying that that's not right either. Obviously, AAA games are playing by a different set of rules because publishers are putting up money to get these games out there, and they want to make sure those games return their investment and then some. So they want these games to provide what they think the consumer is going to want, and they don't want to mix things up too much because that's a risk of losing consumers. So they want to make sure that the core mechanics of a game are there for the fans to enjoy. And then there's innovations within that, minor twists and stuff like that change things up as the series goes along. And then when eventually the series becomes stale enough for even its biggest fans, then the publishers are more willing to, reboot the franchise or revamp the franchise and try something new to see if they can woo those people back and then establish a new, a new watermark or a watershed moment for the franchise and take that on for a number of years. It's lots of money to deal with, so that's certainly why there's not going to be as much innovation there, or as much developers straying from what the norm is for that game or for that genre. And there are definitely different genres out there in AAA. They might be not as numerous as they are in indie, but again, that's because of the development budgets and marketing budgets and just the amount of money in general that's going into it. And when it comes to all that stuff and even how a game looks, that's because there's market research and lots of time being put into trying to figure out what those people want. So they are afraid or unlikely to move away from that because they don't want to alienate the core base that they've taken, double-digit years to build up. But yes, there is variety out there in AAA. There certainly is. There's certainly a different approach to visuals, and there's definitely innovation across all franchises, including like the most established ones. I do agree that it might not be as much as what you see in the indie side, but that's because just as AAA developers are playing by one set of rules, or their own set of rules, indies are doing the same thing as well. So what do we do? How do we fix this situation? I definitely think having labels for genres is important, like RPG and first-person shooter and side-scroller and platformer and racing and whatever else you want to say. But what benefit comes from having labels like indie and AAA? What does the consumer get out of that is a benefit? How many times have you looked at a game, be it screenshots or a trailer, and said, man, this looks like it could be pretty interesting, but I need to know how much money the publisher's going to spend on marketing before I buy it? Or I need to know how much money is being spent on this game before I consider picking it up. Or I need to know, does this have 5 developers working on it or 500? Because that's really going to influence my purchase. Now, I shouldn't say nobody says that, but I would imagine that it's a very, very, very minute amount of people that say that. It's just silly. It's labels for things that shouldn't be there and don't mean anything in the terms of looking at a game and seeing if it interests you. If you see a game and you're interested, you're interested. If you see a game and you're not, you're not. The labels just allow people to use blanket terms to bash everything that comes from that side of development. So this AAA game looks bad and all AAA games are a waste of time. Or this indie game looks bad and all indie games are garbage because they use pixel art. Like those blanket statements do nothing, and that in turn means the labels do absolutely nothing. All that matters is we have games that that developers are working hard on, and they want to give us a certain type of experience. So it's got to get out there, and we play it for what it is, not for, how much marketing money is spent on it. It's silly. I mean, the indie label certainly didn't have the negative connotations tied to it that it does now when it originally came about. It just was used to really mean what it originally meant, to show you that people were making games outside of the very established side of developers and publishers, the way that most of us grew up on games, knew how games were made. And then, the indie scene really blew up. Independent developers came around and were making games without publishing labels and doing their own thing. Now, indie is just something people can say to bash an entire type of game. And it's not right. Is it ever going to change? Probably not. Is it going to get worse? Probably. And that's sad. If you're one of the people that says stuff like, more indie garbage or more AAA garbage, think about what you're saying. Really think about it. You're bashing the hard work of developers, 1 to 1,000. It doesn't matter. You're bashing their work and not even giving it a chance because of what you see. You're not bashing it because of the developer, and you're not bashing it because of the size of the team or the marketing budget. What you're really saying is, this game has pixel graphics, and that means it's low quality and garbage to me. or this game is a first-person shooter with a sci-fi theme, and I don't like that, so that means all AAA games are bad. Think about that. Why would you take that approach? It's not the way to handle things. To badmouth so much hard work of so many people, is that really how you want to approach things? If you have a game system and you're saying that kind of stuff, maybe you need to take a step back and think about why you're saying it and think about why you're coming from that perspective. Maybe what you need to do is recognize that you have a game system and it plays games. And maybe you should open up yourself to perhaps playing a game that has a sci-fi setting, first-person shooter from a big-name developer. Maybe you'll like one of them. Or maybe you should look at indie games that use retro-style graphics and think, you know, that's not my cup of tea visually, but maybe I'll give it a shot and I'll find myself surprised. And if you're not willing to do any of that, that is sad, certainly, but it's your right to not do that. But then why bash the people that are making those games? You're bashing not just whatever game you're leaving those comments on. You're not only bashing that game and the people involved with it, you're bashing an entire industry of people. An entire industry of people that are creating things for a hobby that you enjoy. Drop the labels and expand your horizons. What's the worst that could happen? You play a game that you think you won't like and then you don't like it? Okay, that's fine. Then you didn't like it. What's the best that could happen? You could be like, oh my god, I was completely wrong about this, and I've been looking at indie or AAA games in a completely wrong light. I don't know why I did that to myself, and I don't know why I was saying stuff like that. And it could come out with a whole new appreciation for all different types of games. So I'd say, you know, the positives versus the negatives. I would say the positives really have the potential to outweigh the negatives. You ever work on something and put a lot of time into it, and then when you're all done, you're like, well, this is going to be pointless. That's how I feel right now. But, you know, rather than deleting this whole thing, hopefully at least one person out there will get something positive out of it. And I hope that person is you. So thanks for taking the time to listen to this. Please hit up the comments, and like I always say, let me know why you agree, why you disagree. Tell me why I'm completely wrong or an idiot. You do whatever you want. But thank you if you listen to the entire thing, and I will certainly see you again in the future with another Talking Points. Hey guys, RMC here from Go Nintendo. If you like what you saw in the video, why don't you give us a thumbs up and maybe even subscribe? We'd love to have you. If you want to see what else we're up to, you can check out GoNintendo.com for 24-hour Nintendo news. You can visit us on Facebook at Facebook.com/GoNintendo. You can check us out on Twitter at Twitter.com/GoNintendoTweet. And we're even over on Instagram at Instagram.com/GoNintendo. I put all the links in the description just to make it easier for you guys to follow. Thanks a lot.